All right, guys, we're going to continue with our biodiversity section. We're going to talk a little bit today about different species and the niches that those species inhabit. So first of all, species diversity or biodiversity in general sort of depends on two terms. The first one is what we call species richness. Species richness essentially means how many different types of species are present. So if you're talking like an area like a coral reef or a tropical rainforest, you have a vast array of different species, okay? And so even though you might have a lot of fish, there's a lot of different varieties of fish. Even though you've got a lot of plant life in the tropical rainforest, there are thousands upon thousands of different species within that. And then you might have an environment like, say, a lot of deciduous forests in a certain area. So maybe you have a forest that is mostly maples, and so maybe you've only got 20 or 30 different kinds of species overall because the forest is dominated by the maples, and that would indicate an ecosystem in which it didn't have a wide variety of species richness. The species evenness, and I really hate this term, but this is the term that gets used. Species evenness basically means how many of each species are there. So are there a lot of them? And if there are, then you have a high species evenness, and if there's a low amount, then you have a really low species evenness. Now you can have both of these things. You could have a lot of each species, okay, which would be the evenness, and you could have a bunch of different kinds of species, which would be the richness, or you could have one or the other. Okay, so you might have a lot of maple trees, but that might be one of very few different species or different kinds of organisms in that ecosystem, which would be a low species richness. Now, why this matters to us is because in biodiversity terms, ecosystems that are species rich, that have a lot of different species, tend to be a lot more productive and sustainable. Now, first off, they're productive because the large number of species produce more biomass. Now, you can make an argument that if you had a high species evenness, even if you had a low number of species, but you had a lot of the few species you had, that you could still be very productive. And that, of course, is true. You can have ecosystems that are relatively monolithic in that they only have a few species and are still pretty productive. I mean, farmland obviously is a pretty good example of that, that say you're producing a whole lot of corn, but that's all you're producing on that area. But in general, the more different kinds of species, the more productive. And perhaps what's more important is that the more paths in the food web you have, the more sustainable it is. And we did some of these activities where you have a food web, and if you just pull out a couple of things, then your food web might collapse. So it only takes a couple of species to collapse a food web if you only have 20 or 30 species. On the other hand, if you've got hundreds upon thousands of species, a lot of species richness, that's kind of insurance, because if a couple of those species die off for whatever reason, then the rest of the species can still survive because they have other pathways to get their nutrition. So a niche or a niche and really which way you pronounce it really doesn't matter because you're going to be writing it most of the time. I've heard it pronounced both ways. I tend to prefer niche, but that kind of makes you sound like you're trying to be really highfalutin, and I'm not. So if you say niche, that's fine. The niche that a niche is basically just where in the ecosystem does a species fit. And so there are two broad categories. Then we're going to talk about the five sort of more specialized categories. So specialists have a very narrow niche. They only eat a few different things, or they're only in a certain part of the ecosystem. And you might have a lot of them, but they're not using up an enormous amount of resources. That is in comparison to a generalist. And a generalist has a really broad niche. In other words, it means that it has a lot of different resources that it can pull from. And so a couple of great examples of this, and I love both of these examples really. The first example here of a specialist, this is a koala. And of course, koalas basically eat eucalyptus. You can't get much more specialized than that. They eat eucalyptus leaves. And so if they run out of eucalyptus, then they're probably going to be in a wee spot of trouble. To me, the most awesome example of a generalist is something like a cockroach. This actually is a special kind of cockroach, so I'm probably kind of skirting the rules here. It's a Madagascar hissing cockroach. But cockroaches can eat just about anything. They can eat fingernail clippings. They can eat dissolved salt residues, the stuff that you spill on the ground. They're going to happily go, eat that Coke that you spilled on the ground up. So they are like a classic example of generalists. Now, there are lots of other specialists. I know that when we discussed this a little in class, I'm going to mention pandas. They're a great example of specialists. Other good example of generalists would be like raccoons. And of course, humans are great generalists. We can draw from a vast array of things to be able to get our nutrition. So those are two broad category specialists in general. So we're going to talk about the 5 sort of major roles within an ecosystem that things can fill. So native organisms are those that are normally live and thrive in that particular ecosystem. Now this can be, sort of a wishy-washy term, because when we say normally live, I mean, what does that mean? Does that mean in the past 100 years? Does it mean in the past 10,000 years? Does it mean they've been there for millions of years? But in general, if you were in an ecosystem, the things that you would normally see there, those are what we refer to as native organisms. That is in stark comparison to non-native organisms. Non-native organisms are organisms that might actually thrive in a particular ecosystem, but aren't endemic to that area. They're not sort of meant to be there, or they're not initially there. And of course, kudzu, of course, is a great example. It thrives so much in the south. In fact, it thrives so much that it starts to choke out the other organisms. But it's not native to the south. It's actually native to Asia. And of course, we have several names for these. The one that you'll probably hear the most is invasive. Invasive organisms we bring in, and then they're going to cause all kinds of problems. The Asian carp that we talked about in class is another awesome example of that. Another major role for these species are indicator species. These are species that are going to basically tell us when something's going wrong in the ecosystem, and they tell us pretty early on because they start to die off. The example I have here is poisonous dart tree frogs. Amphibians in particular tend to be pretty sensitive to changes in the ecosystem, partially because of the way their life cycle works. That their eggs are in the water, and so any damage to the water is going to damage the eggs and cause some problems for them, and then they might be sterile and not able to reproduce. Other good examples are usually things like sometimes insects and birds. And part of the reason why they're such good indicators, since they're small, they can pick up on toxins and changes, and they have a really dramatic effect on them pretty rapidly. So those types of species are what we call indicator species. They sort of tell us the well-being of that particular species, particular ecosystem. The fourth role is that of a keystone species, and we've talked about this before. A keystone species is, it is what it sounds like. It's like a central organism in that ecosystem. It doesn't mean it's the central, like the whole ecosystem will collapse without it. But there's a chance that it might. The ecosystem would change dramatically if it wasn't there. And a couple of great examples, like bees tend to be a pretty good keystone species because obviously they're going to pollinate a lot of different types of plants. Alligators in wetlands a lot of times are keystone species. They build particular habitats, and that helps, that sort of changes the ecosystem around them. A lot of times we'll find a lot of what we call top predators, things at the top trophic level. A lot of times those are keystone species because they're going to help to regulate the populations of every other species. There's a lot of overlap between the two terms of foundation and keystone species. In fact, you could make a pretty good argument that a lot of things are both, like alligators are a great example. But a foundation species, generally what we would say the difference between it and a keystone species is it's actually going to change the environment, okay? It's going to do something that actually affects the environment. And my favorite example of this are beavers, because they're going to build dams, and therefore they're actually going to create sort of a new ecosystem behind that dam. And so therefore a lot of species are going to have their ecosystem affected by that dam that the beavers built, and that's sort of the foundation for the whole ecosystem. Again, alligators I think are a great example of both because they also create these dens and these holes that they live in, their dens, that sort of change the ecosystem around them. So not only are they a keystone species, as in they're really important if you pull them out, but they also shape the ecosystem, which is what a foundational species would do as well.